and welcome to the 21st edition of the World Sustainable Development Summit. I am Vidhu Kapoor. This is a special high-level session titled Multilateralism and Global Action in the Anthropocene for Planetary Resilience. This session will be moderated by Ambassador Chandrashekhar Dasgupta, Distinguished Fellow Emeritus TERI. The keynote addresses in the session will be given by Mr. Frans Timmermans, Vice President of European Commission, Ms. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Mr. Pema Gyamtsho, Director General, International Center of Integrated Mountain Development. The leadership addresses will be given by Dr. Bambang Susantono, Vice President, Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development, Asian Development Bank, and Mr. John Room, Regional Director, South Asia Sustainable Development, World Bank Group. Now may I request Ambassador Chandrashekhar Dasgupta to take on the floor, sir. Please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in this session, we shall consider the role of multilateral institutions in addressing global environmental problems, the respective roles of the United Nations, its subsidiary bodies, its agencies and treaty organizations, as also regional cooperation organizations and financial institutions, both global and regional. We shall also consider whether there is a need for new institutions to protect the global commons. We are fortunate to have as our speakers today some of the most eminent and distinguished practitioners in these fields. And I have the honor first to invite Mr. Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the European Commission, a former Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, to make his keynote address. Mr. Timmermans.
Yes, but I thought we would be hearing from
Yes.
Vice President Timmermans first.
Yeah, I'm sorry, there was
In your hands.
a little confusion. May I invite Ms. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and former Foreign Minister of Mexico, to make the first keynote address.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I want to warmly welcome all of you, and I want to say that I look forward to the time where we can again meet in person. I am cautiously optimistic that we are moving in that direction. Thank you to TERI for organizing this summit. TERI is a treasured institution whose discussions on sustainable development and climate action have been influential for decades in India and throughout the world. These are precisely the conversations we need to have globally in 2022. This year, global efforts to address climate change begin from a somewhat different perspective. This is the result of the outcomes of COP26. I will talk about those outcomes today, but in keeping with today's theme of multilateralism and global action, I want to address how the multilateral process was central to those COP26 outcomes, why it remains central to international climate efforts, and how it positively impacts other global issues. Let's begin with COP26, and by acknowledging that while we achieved significant progress in several areas, not everyone got what they wanted. That's the nature of consensus. It's far from perfect. And yes, I was also frustrated we couldn't do more. I recall Frans Timmermans, who will be also taking part today in this conversation, stating this eloquently in the closing plenary. This idea of knowing more could and should be done, but recognizing parties must move forward. Representatives from island nations were equally and rightfully so vocal at the end of COP. Let's not forget, not all of us went back to homes in danger of being taken by rising waters. Many of them did. So did many other delegates and activists who are directly impacted by this climate emergency. Nevertheless, the final package, agreed multilaterally in Glasgow, was the most significant progress achieved since the Paris Agreement was adopted. Parties left with clarity on the work needed to reach the 1.5-degree goal. The Paris Agreement rulebook was completed, an extremely significant accomplishment. It was a long and often contentious road to achieve it. The rulebook paves the way for countries to move beyond the negotiation stage and to put focus where it should be, on implementation. Because of COP26, we will now see carbon credit trading and a framework for non-market-based approaches become operational. When we talk of contentious issues, this was a big one. Achieving consensus was significant. The enhanced transparency framework was also completed, which will build trust between nations. I'm sorry. The parties also strengthened the Santiago network. Let me get some water. Thank you, I'm sorry. Parties also strengthened the Santiago network, providing technical support for countries to address loss and damage related to climate change. And it is a major achievement that the phasing down of unabated coal power was mentioned in the text, along with the phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Each item is deserving of a full discussion on their own. Each represents an incredible amount of work. Each represents multilateral progress. Any notion, however, that we can ease up after Glasgow is misguided. Even with the multiple challenges we face throughout the world, anthropogenic climate change remains the most significant, alarming, and rapidly escalating crisis facing humanity. I could recite statistics to you today, but I won't. You all know them. I'm confident that the IPCC report coming in a few weeks will likewise give us the prognosis that these impacts will continue to grow in severity. Unfortunately, but this is the reality we will have to face. So statistics are important, but they are static. It's what humanity does with them that's important. Wringing our hands momentarily and moving on achieves nothing. The science must instead be a catalyst for climate action. Here, I'm talking about concerted transformative action throughout all sectors. That's why Glasgow ended nothing. It simply shifted our collective work to a new phase, implementation of the Paris Agreement at the national level. Nations now have an agreed blueprint and framework for implementation, have rules ensuring the transparency of the process, and are fully accountable to each other, and this is very important, accountable with respect to supporting each other in meeting their obligations under the Paris Agreement. This work must begin immediately, in 2022. The road ahead is difficult, yet we do have reasons for optimism, because Glasgow also proved that multilateralism remains the world's vehicle for addressing climate change. COP26 was, in fact, a victory for multilateralism. It didn't capture headlines, but its ripple effects positively impact not only climate change, but other global issues. For 5 years, we heard multilateralism was in decline, that its influence was on the wane. That's not what we saw in Glasgow. Instead of rejection, we saw reaffirmation. We saw approximately 200 nations, all part of the Paris Agreement, a global agreement that has near universal membership, come together and achieve consensus. Its reaffirmation gives us renewed faith we can address some of our other major challenges as well, especially those outlined in the SDGs. It strengthens the base for the countless other issues humanity must address as well. I cannot state it enough. A multilateral victory for climate change represents a victory for multilateralism itself. Is it a perfect process? No. It can be excruciating slow. Currently, multilateralism is being outpaced by climate change, and nations must turn that around. Our job at UN Climate Change is to support nations in doing that. But nations are responsible to each other. They must continue to push, and we will continue to support. Multilateralism must also continue to evolve. At UN Climate Change, we've done this by introducing inclusive multilateralism. It's about going beyond the traditional definition of multilateralism and bringing more groups to the table. We know that governments alone cannot provide all the answers, all the solutions, or all the finance to address climate change. Our discussions include non-party stakeholders, including youth, women, indigenous groups, and many others. We listen, we incorporate, and we include. Some of you may know I've been a diplomat almost my entire career, and I assure you that inclusivity, for all its complexity, is the only way forward. Nowhere is it truer than with respect to climate change, which is not a regional or continental phenomenon, but is felt globally. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we have numerous areas which we must address on the road to COP27. We need work on mitigation, on adaptation, on loss and damage, on finance. We need to ensure the 100 billion goal is met. We need much stronger NDCs and long-term climate strategies by all nations, especially G20 nations. We need businesses to transform, to become more sustainable. We need people to re-examine how they consume, to make choices resulting in a more resilient planet. All of this is difficult, but we are making progress. We have the results of COP26 upon which we can build, and our multilateral base is now stronger. I encourage you all to keep moving forward, to never lose faith, to continue acting and to reach for the highest possible goals instead of the lowest hanging fruit. It's what 2022 must be about. It's what COP27 must be about. And that's what we need to achieve the promises of the Paris Agreement and to ensure the longevity and health of humanity on this planet in the Anthropocene and beyond must be about as well. Thank you very much for listening to me. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Patricia Espinosa, for that inspiring address, for pointing out the many positive outcomes of COP26 at Glasgow, while reminding us at the same time of the challenges that remain to be addressed and the need to speed up action. May I now call upon Mr. Pema Gyamtsho, Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development and former Minister of Agriculture and Forests in Bhutan, to deliver his keynote address.
Excellency, Mr. Chandrashekhar Dasgupta. Can you hear me?
Not very well.
Not clear, is it? Okay. Is it better? Is it better now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ms. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary
No, thank you.
Commission on Climate Change.
Yes.
Your Excellency, Mr. Frans Timmermans.
Sorry, your voice went off once again. It wasn't very clear.
Not clear? Yeah.
Okay, now, yes.
Excellency, distinguished persons. On behalf of the International Center for Integrity, ICIMO, I would like to thank the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, for inviting me to participate in this plenary session of WSDS 2022. Let me join others in congratulating TERI for managing to organize this summit under prevailing situation. Yes. Yeah. Still better? Can you hear me now? Still difficult?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. Still struggling a bit. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Right. So I just want to introduce ICIMO upfront. ICIMO is an international intergovernmental regional knowledge and learning center for the Hindu Kush Himalayan region that extends across 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. ICIMO's mission is to contribute to its member countries' efforts to protect the physical environment of the mountains and to improve the socio-economic well-being of the people living in the mountain region by bridging science with policy practice. The HKH region is often referred to as the third pole or the water towers of Asia, as it has the largest area under ice and snow outside of the poles and is the source for 10 major rivers of Asia, including the Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra. We refer to it as the pulse of the planet because what happens in the mountains not only affects 240 million people living therein, but also an estimated 1.9 billion people living downstream basins of the rivers. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, multilateral organizations and systems on global economic governance and global environment governance need greater synergy and coherence. Despite putting in considerable efforts over the past years, environment and ecology are still not well integrated into the functions of multilateral research, development, and financial institutions. There is thus an urgent need for rethinking the structure and the workflows of institutions and visualizing how their functions can be repurposed to seamlessly address the environmental and ecological challenges. Thus, at this crucial juncture in the Anthropocene, it is important to reform and strengthen existing multilateral agreements and explore other innovative mechanisms. There is also a need to further integrate scientific knowledge like those from the IPCC and IPBES assessment of multilateral umbrella organizations such as the UNFCCC and the UNCBD with economic governance systems. At ICIMO, we are engaged in generating scientific knowledge and in gathering evidence on a vast range of environmental and ecological issues, including climate change and biodiversity laws aimed at influencing investment decisions on both environment and economic governance systems. For example, our Hindu Kush Himalayan Assessment Report that we published in 2019 provided compelling evidence that the Hindu Kush Himalayan region is not only a hotspot of cultural and biological diversity, but also it is fast turning into a climate hotspot. It highlighted that environmental and ecological issues transcend national boundaries and in turn influence the economic well-being and safety of the people in adjoining countries. Therefore, among others, the report called for 6 urgent actions to enhance regional cooperation in addressing climate change and holding biodiversity laws. The HKH assessment report also helped us to galvanize the interest and whet the appetite of our 8 regional member countries to strengthen regional cooperation. The strong evidence that the report produced on the rapid melting of snow and ice, pointing towards a future that even a 1.5 degrees centigrade world is going to be too hot for the HKH region, served as a wake-up call for our member countries. They responded positively by coming together at a ministerial mountain summit in October 2020 to endorse the HKH call to action through a ministerial declaration. We are now working with a high-level task force from the member countries to explore the possibility of establishing regional cooperation similar to the Arctic Council and Alpine Convention. Further, based on the HKH call to action and mandated by the Ministerial Declaration 2020, ICIMO was able to present a unified HKH position at COP26 in Glasgow. I agree with the Honorable Executive Secretary that COP26 was a way forward. There was movement forward. And for the region, we also had a forward movement. With the support of our member countries, we positioned the HKH region as a unique global asset that is under unprecedented threats from climate change and requires urgent support from the global community through investments in finance and technology. We have collectively argued the need for capitalizing on the opportunities that the region presents for enhanced investment and proposed an investment framework called the Mountains of Opportunities. I am happy to share that ICIMO is pursuing a landscape and river basin-based approach to generate knowledge on these transboundary issues in our region, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, air pollution, and natural disasters. Currently, we are engaged in 4 transboundary landscapes: the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, Pamir landscape, the Kailash sacred landscape, the Kanchenjunga and Far Eastern Himalaya landscape, and 2 river basins, the Upper Indus River Basin and the Koshi River Basin. This approach allows ICIMO to effectively play its role as a regional neutral convener for bringing scientists, policymakers, and practitioners from our member countries to share their scientific findings, relevant policies, and practices. Of course, we work through and in partnership with national agencies and organizations, including universities and civil societies. It is therefore heartening for us to note that ecosystem-based approaches are being considered and advocated by the Glasgow Climate Pact. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, planetary crisis is at the peak, with warnings of the 6th mass extinction event, or called the Holocene extinction, if the course of action is not corrected for greening our economies and restoring the fast degrading ecosystems. This crisis is amplified in the mountains, where key ecosystems such as the cryosphere, Wetlands, peatlands, rangelands, and forests are among the most vulnerable to climate and land use changes. We hope that we will find traction and aided resonance with our partner organizations and development partners gathered. We also hope that our region will rapidly move towards a stronger regional cooperation in addressing transboundary issues and addressing upstream, downstream linkages. In this regard, events such as the WSDS could play a pivotal role in promoting understanding and cooperation. When I listened to the speeches yesterday and today from world leaders and thought leaders, I could not help but mention that my little home country, Bhutan, has not done too badly. We consider that every living being on Earth has an equal right to life on this planet, and that the habitat it occupies, be it a rock, a mountain, a pond, or a lake, is the sanctuary of our guardian deities and protector spirits. Therefore, before we cut a tree, use pesticides to control pests, remove a rock or throw a bottle into a lake, we think twice because we are concerned that it would attract the wrath of the resident spirits. Hence, our policy on tourism, for example, that is high value, low impact, is not misplaced because it is aimed at exactly honoring the limits that our small land area could absorb without affecting our environment and culture. As Honorable Prime Minister of India, Shri Modi ji, said yesterday in his inaugural address, it is not the environment that is fragile, but us, the people. In our fragility of mind and morality, our quest for dominance over all other beings and objects, and mindless pursuit of wealth and pleasure lie the root causes of the problem we are facing now. Therefore, as he also rightly promulgated, we need pro-planet people and coalition of like-minded people to make a difference in reversing the current trends. My understanding is that, by extension, this would include pro-planet governments, organizations, and communities and individuals. Let me end here by once again congratulating the organizers of WSDS 2022, in particular Dr. Viva Dhawan, Director General of TERI, and her team for successfully hosting this very important event. Thank you, and over to you.
Mr. Pema Gyamtsho, for that fascinating account of the role of ICIMOD in promoting regional cooperation in science and technology on a vital issue, and also for reminding us of the lessons which your own country, Bhutan, has to offer to the rest of humanity in the area of sustainable development and protection of nature. May I now request Mr. Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the European Union and former Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, to make his presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today on multilateralism and our road to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. At the end of this year, the world will again gather in response to a crisis that threatens our very existence. The climate crisis is already wreaking havoc in each and every one of our countries. We can tackle it, but only if we all work together in close cooperation. Because a planetary emergency needs a global response. Just a few months ago, all nations agreed to keep temperature rise at 1.5 degrees, and we concluded the rules that allow us to implement the Paris Agreement. In many ways, COP26 was the moment where the world started to move from ambition to action. We got there thanks to multilateralism, thanks to the stubborn commitment of almost 200 countries who worked hard to find agreement, and we found it. We came to an agenda that has given me hope. Hope that I can tell my kids, my grandson, and soon my granddaughter, we're doing this for you, and we can actually achieve it. I think that Glasgow also proved that the multilateral system works, that this is the way to build stronger, more diverse, and more inclusive partnerships, the way to provide a joint response to the challenges of today and those of tomorrow. Now, This is not to say that the multilateral system works flawlessly. We all know that there are areas where the system is not or no longer fit for purpose. This is why the European Union continues to support reform efforts. We will promote the modernization of the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization and other key institutions. We will also push for the development of new global norms and cooperation platforms on taxation, circular economy, artificial intelligence. Looking back at COP26, I think it was a clear success for the global community. We agreed to end coal and fossil fuel subsidies. We put in place clear rules for transparent reporting of emissions and carbon markets, and we committed to increase our work on adaptation and adaptation finance. Developed nations failed to mobilize the $100 billion in climate finance that was committed. We are, however, on track to reach that goal by next year, and I want to work to actually meet it this year. The EU has been a consistent donor, and we will continue talking to other donors to meet this figure as soon as possible. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, COP26 gave us a shot at keeping global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade. And if all pledges are fully implemented, the path could bring us to 1.8 degrees centigrade. But 1.8 is not 1.5. There is still a lot of work ahead to keep the commitment we made in Glasgow. We need to aim higher. So our task is to continue working together to implement concrete domestic policies and ensure that every party submits an NDC that is in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. I think that in many ways, India was also a key player at COP26. Prime Minister Modi's announcement of a 2070 net zero target was very positive and very welcome. This target will help to steer India's own green transition, and in the context of COP26, it was this announcement that helped to bring the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. India has always walked the talk, and we're therefore looking forward to the further plans for your green transition. Submitting an updated nationally determined contribution and a long-term strategy would enable India to take a leading role in the delivery of the Glasgow Agreement and make your country a global example. In several areas, India is already there. The commitment to install 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 is a prime example of India's global leadership. The European Union and India are already working together for the green transition, and we are eager to continue and expand that work. The International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure are two excellent examples of our cooperation so far. Over the coming months, I also hope to continue the discussion started at COP26 on phasing out coal and ensuring a just transition. We are likewise looking forward to expanding our cooperation on green hydrogen, including by organizing a first EU-India Hydrogen Forum. In the EU in 2022, ambitious climate action will continue to be at the top of our political agenda. We're currently working with our member states and the European Parliament to negotiate the new legislation to cut emissions by at least 55% by 2030 as compared to 1990. In this global fight, the EU is committed to doing our part and to deliver at home what we agreed in Paris and Glasgow. In the run-up to COP27, the EU will continue reaching out either bilaterally or through the G7, the G20, MOCA, and the High Ambition Coalition. I will again travel and listen to our partners' concerns, challenges, and discuss opportunities for a just transition. The better we know and understand each other's circumstances, the better our response, and the easier it will be to ensure the right support flows, whether it's climate finance, technology, or know-how. Before I close, please allow me to briefly address another COP that will also take place this year, because there is another crisis for which the world will gather to find a common response. This is the biodiversity crisis. The biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are closely interlinked, and humanity is slowly but surely grasping the magnitude of these crises. The good news is that our answers to the climate crisis, whether in mitigation or in adaptation, can also help to restore biodiversity. When we protect and restore wetlands, peatlands, coastal and marine ecosystems, when we develop urban green spaces and install green roofs, when we manage forests and farmland in a sustainable way, we adapt to climate change, but we also ensure clean water, healthy soils, and space for nature to flourish. That is why the Glasgow Climate Agreement also underlines the importance of nature-based solutions. During COP15, the European Union will push to protect 30% of all land and 30% of all sea by 2030. Nature is our biggest ally in the fight against the climate crisis. And instead of making it pay the price for our pollution, we need to protect nature so that it can protect us. Let me conclude here and thank you very much for your attention. Let's all remember that the fight against the climate and biodiversity crises is a fight for our common future. In this fight, the EU and India will be close partners, I'm sure. So let's continue our work and let's keep remembering why we do it, so that our children and grandchildren can still live happy, healthy lives on this planet we share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans, for that inspiring talk, for those inspiring words. You pointed out what was achieved at COP26, what remains to be done, the interdependence and interconnections between protection of biodiversity and climate action, and finally, for your very important remarks concerning the role played by India in the climate talks. You described our 2070 net zero aim target as very positive and very welcome. You referred to the importance of the role of the International Solar Alliance, the scope for Indo-EU cooperation on green hydrogen, and in other areas. Thank you very much for covering such a broad agenda in a short talk, but in a very pointed fashion. May I now call upon Mr. Bambang Susantono, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank and former Vice Minister of Indonesia's Ministry of Transportation, to deliver his leadership address. Mr. Bambang Susantono.
Thank you, Ambassador. A very good day to our distinguished and all those joining us around the globe. It is a great pleasure for me to join these distinguished sessions, and thank you to TERI for organizing this strategic and important event. I would like to use my slides to briefly explain my views on the role of multilateral development banks in promoting policies and practices for climate resilient development. May I have my slide 1, please? Okay. So we all know that the rise in greenhouse gas emissions has contributed to the rapid changes in global climatic patterns. Also, the impact of climate change is growing alarmingly. This has profound socioeconomic effects on human health, food security, infrastructure, and development. As you can see in the slide, the Asia and Pacific region is most vulnerable to disasters caused by natural hazards, with climate change increasing both the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. This endangers life and aggravates poverty. The grim pictures also tells us that we all must act now. We need to push for net zero emissions while building resilience to climate extremes and their effect on people. As I like to say, we need to build forward better. We need to adapt our investment, development, and recovery plans to match country priorities and climate goals. We can help provide opportunities to boost economies and lower emissions in the short term while contributing to a resilient and equitable transformation over the long term. Next slide, please. At ADB, we are focused on putting economies on a greener and low carbon trajectory. This requires addressing their underlying vulnerabilities and strengthening economic resilience and inclusiveness. Climate finance helps countries adopt and implement the priorities set under their nationally determined contribution and national adaptation plans. This is particularly important as we gradually move away from pandemic restrictions. Our ADB Strategy 2030 has set ambitious climate targets. It calls for 75% of all our operations to support climate action by 2030. Last year, we raised our ambitions to deliver $100 billion in climate financing from 2019 to 2030. We also raised our midterm adaptation finance target to $9 billion from 2019 to 2024 and to $35 billion by 2030. Our integrated holistic approach helps us better predict the impact of multiple types of hazards and thus ways to build more effective resilience. Aside from climate-proofing physical infrastructure, we are investing in more projects with climate adaptations as their primary purpose. At the same time, our investments seek to integrate the ecological, social, institutional, and financial aspect of increasing resilience. Next slide, please. At COP26 last year, ADB delegations, together with other multilateral development banks, committed to support climate and environmental goals by promoting natural capital, biodiversity, and nature-based solutions, or NBS, and to make them gender smart. You can see on the screen some examples of ADB's ongoing projects with strong NBS elements. Our experience shows that adaptation investment that boost resilience include 1. NBS that expand mangroves along coasts. 2. Infrastructure to better manage the risk of flooding. And 3. Climate-smart livelihoods in agroforestry, among others. Most importantly, local communities must play a central role in helping deliver these solutions. Next slide, please. We believe that poor climate adaptation solutions must be delivered at scale and tailored to local conditions. And to do that, ADB is increasing our focus on the poorest and most vulnerable communities across the regions, working closely with our partners. For example, our CRPP program, Community Resilience Partnership Program, supports government and communities across the regions to scale up their pro-poor resilient investment, especially those gender-responsive solutions at the local level. Next slide, please. As developing Asia continues to recover from the devastating impact of COVID-19, we must take advantage of this unique opportunity to build a greener, more resilient, and inclusive future. As the region shifts to a low-carbon path and build more low-carbon infrastructure, we must also boost economic growth and livelihood while upholding climate commitments. Innovative finance can mobilize the much-needed funds from private capital providers for a green and resilient recovery. One example is the ASEAN Green Recovery Platform, which is expected to mobilize $7 million in public and private capital for green infrastructure projects. Also, ADB's green and blue bonds have successfully raised funds for projects that reduce carbon emissions and build climate resilience. Last slide, please. While continuing to build resilience, we must move away from our current unsustainable path. As Fiji's ambassador and permanent representative to the UN, Satyendra Prasad, once said, for some countries, 1.5 might seem a stretch. For us, it is the last compromise possible. So let me end by saying that how the Anthropocene epoch ultimately plays out will depend on all of us. So this is the time for more collaborating and working together. Thank you, and back to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bambang Susantono, for that very lucid account of the role played by the Asian Development Bank in our region. And finally, I request Mr. John Room, Regional Director, South Asia Sustainable Development of the World Bank Group, to make his leadership address.
afternoon, good evening, everybody. Great to see some old friends that we haven't seen in person for a long time. And huge congratulations to TERI for being able to pull this off, even though we can't sip tea in your wonderful grounds in Delhi. So congratulations, thank you. This has been a very interesting set of remarks, and I'm left with two conclusions. One is that even though we didn't coordinate what we're saying, there are a number of common messages, and I think we're very well aligned on a number of elements. But there are also differences in emphasis, which I think is very helpful and allows us to put a bunch of issues on the table. So let me focus my remarks around recognizing that while multilateral action is important, there are opportunities for multilateralism to evolve in ways that allow us to rebalance a little bit more on implementation and better integrating climate and development. And let me make 5 key points, maybe a bit stylized in terms of what I mean by this. First of all, the need to focus rigorously on implementation of short-term actions that are critical to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. Other speakers have talked about the discussion in global fora on 2030 NDC commitments, net zero commitments, all very important. However, now it's very important that we can target multilateral action and support on short and medium term implementation. First of all, because this is what builds the resilience and puts us on the low carbon track. But also, we believe that this helps build confidence for greater commitments in the future. Secondly, the need to better align even further climate and biodiversity actions with other development actions. Most countries right now are very focused on jobs, growth, poverty reduction, and recovery from the COVID recession. All appropriate. But we also know that economic development is already impacted by climate change, and that actions to address climate change, low carbon and climate resilience, can deliver other positive development impacts, jobs and air pollution. So these issues cannot be addressed separately, but need to be addressed in a more integrated way. And so figuring out how we can support this process is important. One thing we're doing on the World Bank Group is introducing what we call country climate and development reports. These reports work with countries to try set out key policy investment priorities in key countries. But they focus on integrating those kinds of actions that drive national development and poverty reduction goals at the same time as addressing climate change, to identify explicitly the synergies between these objectives, and if there are any trade-offs, to be explicit about these and to recommend how to manage them. These priorities will also be placed within realistic, not wishful thinking, fiscal and international financing constraints, and will address the key role of the private sector in delivering on these objectives. By doing this simultaneously across a number of countries, hopefully we'll get some learning, which is a key part of multilateral action. One key part of this, and the way we've been approaching this, is to recognize that a lot of our countries are going through key sectoral transitions, having energy services and access to energy while still low carbon and climate resilient, a transport transition, an urbanization transition, an agriculture and food transition. And focusing on these integrated transitions, we think, is a key way to drive this support, this multilateral support, to the next level. The next point we make is to focus on using multilateral action to support national action at these levels. All of the stuff that the previous speakers have talked about, but from an MDB specific approach, we're trying to meet countries where they are at the moment to integrate and accelerate national action. From the World Bank side in South Asia, we recently released our roadmap, which supports the World Bank Group's climate change action plan, that focuses on driving these kinds of actions in key areas. Relating to what I said before, we're doing things like trying to scale up climate smart agriculture, like we're trying in Maharashtra to increasing incomes. We're focusing on decarbonizing energy, industry, and transport sectors, like the Rewa Solar Park, that actually crowded in private sector investment to reach coal parity. We're trying to focus on sustainable urbanization, including working with Chennai on an integrated set of core urban reforms that will enable an urbanization to take place that delivers services while at the same time being low carbon and climate resilience. And mainstreaming resilience, like we're trying in Corella, shifting from a response to disasters to building capacity going forward. Having said all of this, there are still a number of key areas where multilateral action is needed to complement what happens at this national level support. We could talk a lot about this, a number of others have. I'd like to just highlight two things. The first one is at the risk of stating the obvious and sounding like a broken record. The international community really does need to deliver on the $100 billion goal. It's important symbolically, and it's important to drive this agenda forward. Secondly, Patricia also touched on this, carbon markets and related issues. As many of you know, you'd not be surprised to hear us say that there's a lot of analytics that shows that functioning global carbon markets will dramatically increase the speed with which climate issues can be integrated into development and also reduce the cost. Article 6 allowed us to move forward, and that's a great contribution. However, there's a lot of work to do, and sometimes people say I'm dismissive when I say we've got to focus on the plumbing. How do we actually put the verification in place, the trading regimes in place? How do we use technology through something like a climate warehouse in order to support this support? And this has to be done multilaterally. Final comment is on the MDBs and a shifting role that we see for the MDBs. We've made a lot of discussion as a group of MDBs on the increase in overall climate finance, reaching $66 billion in 2020. That's great. The World Bank, we have our own commitments in this regard. But frankly, as impressive as this is, and as proud as we are of this, this is not the whole story, and it's not enough. As MDBs, we think we need to focus more and more on catalyzing the transitions I've talked about before at scale and crowding in other sorts of financing. We've all bandied around this number, $16 trillion of money sitting around in negative yielding assets. There's an opportunity for the MDBs to use our unique role on the policy side through our de-risking instruments to try to crowd this financing in. So the shift in terms of how we can create these conditions for market-oriented, low carbon and climate resilient growth is important. It's not just a question around our financing. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Room, for that for that very incisive comments concerning the connections between climate change and other sustainable development issues. Now, the next item will be a round of discussions based on points by speakers, and I'm going to draw on Mr. Room's comments. I think they were, very specific on this point. And I pose two questions, and I'd be grateful if you would answer in one sentence what you feel about it. So the first question is this, that while we recognize the importance of long-term goals in coping with climate change, the focus should be on short-term actions. And it's very important that we retain this focus if we are going to achieve any significant progress. What comments would you have on that? Would you be in agreement, or do you have another view? Ms. Espinosa, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, John, for your participation and your perspective. And I'm delighted really by the amount of expertise, but also the many roads that are being explored by so many institutions with so many different perspectives around the world. It is reassuring to me as the head of UN Climate Change to see how much is going on. Regarding this point about the need to focus on short and medium-term actions, I would agree fully with John. And if we look at the fact that by 2030, that's only only less than 8 years from now, by 2030, we need to be at minus 45% emissions. That means that this decade is really absolutely crucial. I mean, while I wouldn't make any very scientific analysis, but my guess from what I have seen and my experience and the depth of the transformation that needs to take place means that the next 2 years, this year, maybe at the most the next 2 years, is where those transformative decisions need to be taken. If we talk about the transformation of transportation systems, of the transformation of energy systems, if we talk about transformation of agriculture systems, we know all of that is going to take some time until we can see clearly the effect in terms of reduction of emissions. So I fully agree with that. Although I have to say, I believe that in this very critical emergency, we do not have the luxury of saying, okay, we will only focus on this.
No.
At the same time, we still need to focus on the longer term vision. And, you know, we have no choice. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Mr. Pema Gyamtsho, do you have any comment on that? Just a single sentence will do.
Just quickly, I think there are so many things that we see right in front of our eyes, you know, where we can do something immediately. Just one example, look at the wetlands, the marshy areas. In many of our countries is treated as wasteland.
Right. I'm sorry.
And unless we do that, we are going to have drying springs, drying streams, and so on. The other area is the wildfires, forest fires. I think we can stop that. That is happening right in front of our eyes. And yet we talk about something that is happening 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the line, but we are not able to take action. So just some quick examples. I'll hand over back to you.
Yes.
Excellency, yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Mr. Bambang Susantono.
Yes, thank you. It's supposed to be 1 or 2 sentences.
Yes.
I agree that short-term action is very important to demonstrate that we are really translating all commitments into actions. But I would like also to emphasize that we should not lose sight of the LTS, for example, the long-term strategy and the just transition. This is really cannot be done in the very short term, and it has to be step by step and also integrated, comprehensive, and holistic approach in trying to put climate change as embedded factors in all development process, like John also mentioned about that one. Over to you.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Room, did I capture your thought accurately, or would you like to, to refine it?
I think you've caught it. I think that the point that both Patricia and Bambang made, that this is not just an either or, it's a question of emphasis at a certain point in time. The second thing I would say is, somebody once said, I don't know who it was, that success is 10% aspiration, 90% implementation. And that's part of the point that I want to try and get across. It's not to discount the importance of the aspiration. I think that we've made progress on some of those issues, and that's just a question of sort of driving down now on the implementation. Even the just transition, very important, but having some short-term successes. You know, if South Africa can deliver the closing of the Kamati power plant in a successful way that is a demonstration, I think that will hugely help the ability of other countries to move this going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, I'll try and sum up some of the major outcomes of the discussion. First, I think speakers were generally of the opinion that the outcomes of COP26 at Glasgow were very important outcomes but there's no place for complacency. Secondly, the interlinkages between climate change and biodiversity, and indeed other global environmental problems, should be borne in mind as we proceed with action on climate change. Thirdly, I thought there was consensus on the need for enhanced financial support. And finally, the role of non-state actors, that this is very important. And we need not only to stimulate further actions by states parties, but also by non-state actors. Thank you very much. And with that, I bring this session to a close.